G'day, I'm Owen. You've joined the pub test, and in this one we are continuing the Jack the Ripper suspect series, and we are going back over a suspect that has previously been covered, but unlike that overview, this one is going to have a lot more detail and a lot more analysis as well, with some new information thrown in. And at the end, I will be stating my definitive opinion on this particular suspect. We are going to be discussing William Berry. Who was he and how does he fit into the Jack the Ripper saga? Let's put it to the pub test. Now this one is slightly different. I am not going to start from when he was born because we need to first look at what made him famous, for want of a better term. But he did get known for an event that happened not in London, but in Dundee, Scotland. Himself and his wife had recently moved from London around December of 1888, and they were living in that Whitechapel area of Spitalfields and Bethnal Green. But they decided for a fresh start. Now we will be looking at the reasons as to why in more detail later. But they moved into a place 113 Princes Street in Dundee. But William Berry, on the 11th of February 1889, walked into the police station to tell them that his wife, and they'd been married less than a year, but she'd taken her own life. And this was a tragedy. But she took her own life 6 days prior, on the 4th of February. And the police asked, well, why didn't she let us know then? He said, well, I didn't want to be seen as Jack the Ripper. Maybe that was on his mind because they'd just come from London, where Ripper hysteria had only just started dying down after that final victim of Mary Kelly. But it was a very strange comment to make. And they said, well, how do you know that she took her own life? He goes, well, I was drinking, and I was drinking pretty heavily. I passed out on the bed, and when I woke up in the morning, my wife Ellen wasn't there. She wasn't on the bed. So I look around, and in the room, I saw her there, and she had a rope around her neck. Now, whether the police went and investigated this immediately, or whether he gave these details whilst he was talking to the police, it's not exactly known this timeline. But we'll assume that the police decide to go and visit 113 Princes Street. And upon investigation, they do find Ellen inside a crate, and she'd been stabbed, and her abdomen had been cut open. And one of her legs had been broken as well. This is not something that someone could have done to themselves after taking their own life. But William Berry has an explanation for that particular scene. He says he saw his wife on the ground with a rope around her neck. And then a mad impulse came over him, and he doesn't know why, but then he got the knife and stabbed her and cut her. And then had to put her in that crate and didn't fit, so he had to break her leg to fit her in. And he was the next 6 days not knowing what to do. But eventually he had to come forward and let them know what happened, otherwise he would be pinned as a murderer. Even though he did not take her life, is what he was saying. But there was a very odd bit of graffiti inside this house where they'd moved into, in chalk, in 2 spots around the house. One said, Jack the Ripper is behind this door. And then another bit of graffiti said, Jack the Ripper is in the cellar. Very strange, if you ask me, that writing was in that house. But we will look at possible explanations for that graffiti. But on further investigation, the police find something else. That Ellen had marks around her throat, not consistent with the rope. The rope looks like it was a later addition, but rather hand marks. Someone had strangled her, and William Berry had scratch marks on his hands, and those scratch marks and the marks on her neck showed that she was attacked from behind and strangled before he stabbed her. Because on top of that, they found a jumper that was not in the crate, but was in the room, that had the stab marks of the knife through it. So they now know William Berry has committed an absolute heinous murder. But now there was hysteria, not only in Dundee, but in a large part of the United Kingdom. Had Jack the Ripper returned? Had he spread out to other parts of that country? Or should I say landmass, because they're probably different countries. I don't want to start a squabble with people from the United Kingdom. We're going to look at the similarities to that crime, to some that happened in Whitechapel shortly, but who was William Berry and how did he end up in this situation in Dundee? And yes, we will get back to this scene, because there's a lot to unpack here that relates to the Whitechapel crimes. Well, firstly, William Berry was born in 1859 and his father was a fishmonger. And some people say that he learnt a bit of slaughtering skills. I could not corroborate that at all. There is some detail that would suggest he had some slaughtering skills, though I would suggest it's not that important to this story. But his father died when he was only 1 year old, and then his mother ended up in a mental asylum when he was around 3 or 4. So he was brought up by relatives. And so were the rest of his siblings, but he really did struggle. Because he tried various jobs and most of them didn't last because he had anger issues. But of all the different avenues he explored, I found one was quite interesting. He worked for a little while as a locksmith. Which brings me to the Mary Kelly crime. If you are familiar with Jack the Ripper saga, then you would know that the lock on the door to Mary Kelly's room is of intrigue to so many people. Because they say, how did the murderer access the room? And then how did he get out with locking the door? Now, I have covered that in another video and explaining the spring lock. You didn't need to lock it on your way out. It automatically locked. But if Mary Kelly didn't invite this bloke into the room, then a locksmith could have got in there knowing that there was this single woman on her own in that room. Now that is just an interesting little piece of information to pack away, not just for this, but for other times when we're talking about the Mary Kelly murder. But also just another little detail with the Mary Kelly crime scene and a possible connection to William Berry, which is even stronger. At the time of her crime happening, he had his own horse and cart, and there are witnesses in Miller's Court that heard a horse and cart leaving that area the morning when Mary Kelly was found. Yet that was not that uncommon, but my point being there is that someone leaving that area with the horse and cart would not have been noticed at all, because that was not a strange event to happen. But that horse and cart is also very important as we move through this story. Now, there's very little we know about William Berry up until his 28th year of life. Only those little snippets we have. We really don't have any great detail, but we know a lot about what happens when he gets to London in October of 1887. He managed to get a job with a bloke who was in that area around Bethnal Green, Whitechapel and Spitalfields. And the bloke was James Martin, and he sold sawdust. Now, when I first did the William Berry video, I honestly believed that the sawdust was just used by individuals to cover smells from toilet areas. But I was wrong, way wrong. I did not understand or know that sawdust was actually used very extensively in all the pubs and also the slaughterhouses. So after a day's trade, they could get rid of the sawdust, and all the filth that ended up mixed in with the sawdust would obviously stick together, they'd shovel that out, and then they'd need some more sawdust put in for the next day. And that makes a lot of sense when you consider they didn't have chemicals and flooring was different. This was the best way of trying to keep things hygienic. But also we can then understand how filthy the streets must have been as well. And that also, there's a lot here that we need to look at more extensively. As I said, this is a deeper dive, but the filthiness of the streets also plays a part in the William Berry story. But getting back to the point here, selling sawdust was very lucrative. It was a consumable. People would need to buy it all the time. So if you had access to sawdust, you'd be making some serious ching. But it probably wasn't as lucrative as James Martin's other business that he had running side by side with his sawdust selling. He had a decent establishment where there was lots of young women, and blokes used to come and go for indeterminate amount of times and pay money to stay in the rooms with those women. Yes, he ran a brothel as well. That was highly, highly illegal. Yet, with the sawdust business, he could virtually launder his money. Before, probably money laundering was a thing. But no one would have thought, oh, where's this bloke getting all his cash from? Because they'd say, oh, that's James Martin, the sawdust seller. And so he could hide the other activities that were going on at his establishment. But there was one particular woman who worked in that brothel, and that was Ellen Elliott. And Ellen, she had a tough life. Her circumstances were not great, and that's why she was now working at a brothel. But you know, working in those places was much better than the unfortunates out on the street. Even though she would have been considered an unfortunate, it was a much better situation because you didn't have to go trolling for your customers and you already had a roof over your head. And it would be seen that James Martin did actually look after his staff, including the women that he had. But even the blokes who were selling the sawdust, who were delivering the sawdust, if they had not enough money to go find a place to stay, he would let them sleep in the stables with the horses. And you think, well, that's a bit rough. Well, really, it was a lot better than their option. And so ones like William Berry, who got paid, well, William Berry would spend most of his money on drink and also unfortunates. Not the ones inside James Martin's establishment, but the ones out on the street. So often, William Berry slept in the stables. But because he was around James Martin's other business quite a lot, he got to know Ellen and then struck up quite the friendship very quickly. Now, I have to make a very important point in this one. Ellen Elliott is said to have been illiterate. Now, I know for many people, they assume, therefore, she was just some docile person that was easily led along. That is not the case. See, I know it's stated about Charles Lechmere's wife being illiterate, and that's why he chose her, so he could do his nefarious deeds, and she'd just be none the wiser, happy at home, looking after the kids. But the thing is, Mary Kelly herself was also illiterate. And you might say, Owen, that's a huge statement to make. How could the last official victim of Jack the Ripper, the one that most people focus in on, how do you know she was illiterate? Well, quite simply, if Joe Barnett had to read to her the articles about Jack the Ripper from the newspapers, either one of two things: that Joe himself had such a melodious voice that you couldn't help but wanting to hear him read, or she couldn't read the papers herself. But we don't consider her to be a real docile, imbecile type person. And I would say here, Ellen Elliott wasn't either. But we are going to see that she was the victim of some terrible coercive control. Because why did William Berry choose her as his wife? Well, she was young. She was rather pretty. But she'd actually received an inheritance. A little bit of money came from one of her relatives. And I say a little bit in today's terms. I believe it would be around $20,000, which I believe would be £10,000. Maybe, I don't know, maybe 15,000 if you're in the US. It's not a huge amount of money. It's not money that's life-changing necessarily that you can now just go and retire. But she had a plan. See, she wasn't silly. She invested it. And then she was going to get that return on the investment. And she figured just that little bit of return on this money would mean I could take on other work and I wouldn't have to work at James Martin's establishment anymore. And that was her plan. But still, a woman back then would have struggled to really make a living because it was not a woman's world. This was dominated by males. In fact, the reason why so many women back then were illiterate is because it was deemed that it wasn't that important for them to learn to read and write. They just needed to learn housekeeping, and then they'd be fine because they could go work as a maid or look after kids at home while the husband went out and worked. And she probably saw this William Berry. He's out working. He's a fairly strapping dude. Wasn't that tall though, 5'3" it said. But regardless, he may be going somewhere. And he probably was very charming, as a lot of people of his ilk actually are. But I will get back to that. But it was actually in April of 1888 that they got married. Now, Ellen did already have her own establishment. She was making enough money that she wasn't living at James Martin's business. And it's said that the landlady said she was such a quiet, lovely person to have around. But after marriage, things changed drastically. The noises coming from that room now were terrible. She walked in one time and William Berry has got a bread knife to Ellen while he's holding her on the ground and he's trying to slash at her. 1 week after marriage. That honeymoon did not last very long at all. So what does the landlady do? Well, she decides, I'll ring the police, get this bloke thrown in prison, and I'll save this poor girl from this abominable monster. No, she doesn't do that, actually. She says, look, I can't put up with all this noise. Both of you have to leave. That I find really hard to stomach. And I do understand things were different way back then, but seriously, this bloke obviously had issues. He was still, unbeknownst to Ellen, out with unfortunates all through their courtship, all through their marriage. He wasn't exclusive to her. He was just using her for the money that he could get. If he needed money, he would walk her to the bank to start selling some of her stocks that she had invested. And he would be there at the bank with her while she's making these requests. Now, today we would see that definitely as this terrible coercive control. And someone would raise a flag saying, I don't think this is right. We might put a freeze on your accounts for a little while, but no. He was allowed to bleed her bank accounts dry whilst treating her absolutely terribly. And I can't really go into understanding how someone can allow that to happen to themselves, but it still happens today, and it's not their fault. For whatever reason, they feel trapped, they feel stuck, they don't know what to do, and maybe they really hope the situation will turn around because they still care about this bloke despite what they're doing to them. But regardless, we can definitely say that, William Berry was not a decent bloke. They do find lodgings elsewhere because remember, Ellen still has money so they can afford another place, but the landlord at the next place says, well, that's Berry bloke. He drinks. He hammers down the alcohol, except on a Sunday. Because he was a religious man. He'd go off to church on Sunday, and that's the day that he wouldn't drink. That will also be an important point that we will discuss when we really put this to the pub test. But an event happens that is very, very disturbing. Now, James Martin apparently had fired William Berry from his business because he was a drunkard and not showing up, and so it just was not working out. But William Berry had gone missing for a few days, and Ellen goes looking for him. And she goes into a pub where she sees James Martin and says, look, I'm looking for my husband. And apparently, just by some weird chance coincidence, William Berry's walking by and he goes, there's Bill now. And he starts coming into the pub, and Ellen goes up and says, where were you? Then he lays into her, punches her in the face 3 times, and she hits the ground. Again, why did nobody do anything about this? Why did they not haul Berry off and give him a hiding? It's just absolutely unbelievable that this was allowed to go on. But again, this was a man's world. But it's important to see here too that Berry could go missing for days at a time and really not be missed by that many people. Again, we're going to unpack that too. But because he was sacked by James Martin, Berry says, well, why don't I set up a rival business? I'll sell sawdust. I know the customers. All I need is a horse and a cart. Now, where will I get the money from to get that? I know, Ellen, why don't we sell more of your shares? Then I can set up a rival business to James Martin. And look at the money he's making. We could make that money. So he does get this horse and cart. But because he doesn't know anything about horses, the first horse he got just fell ill and died. So then Ellen buys a second horse, which he somehow manages to keep alive. But he doesn't keep alive the business because he would more drink at the pubs instead of selling them the sawdust. And so this business just failed. So all these events happened in William Berry's life during the Autumn of Terror. Yes, during that time, he had learnt the streets. He often would go walking at night. He would get the services of these unfortunates. He knew the pubs. He would have known the police beats. There is an important thing to do with that horse and cart, particularly on the double event. Now, prior to that, he did not have the horse and cart when the first 2 murders happened of Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman. And it was then, after those events, that the police were stopping almost every bloke on the street. And on the double event, it said that they stopped everybody. That's not actually true. They didn't stop everybody. They stopped everybody who was walking. They didn't stop the people on horses and carts because there was lots of traffic at night going to different businesses, either slaughterhouses or people selling sawdust. So they let the horses and cart go. And a bloke on a horse and cart could quite easily, 1, go from one spot to another very quickly, but 2, be able to hide any of the evidence of having perpetrated a crime. Did William Berry know that to cover his tracks, a horse and cart would be perfect? Well, maybe. And as we stated already, someone heard a horse and cart leave Miller's Court on the morning when Mary Kelly's body was found. But intriguingly, after that Mary Kelly incident, it was not long before William Berry says to Ellen, look, I've got a job offer in Dundee. Now, her money is running out, so she's thinking, oh, he's got a good job offer. Things will finally turn around. Let's go. There was no job. He told other people he was going to Brisbane, Australia. Again, he was never intending to go to Brisbane. What was his intention of going to Dundee? Some people would say it was because he planned to do away with Ellen, and then nobody there would know him and he could get away with it and just disappear. That doesn't make a great deal of sense to me, because very few people knew him in London. He was a nobody. Yes, he was a nobody in Dundee. He only became a somebody that we remember because he did this terrible crime to his wife in that town. But there's just an intriguing detail in his confession or interrogation with the Dundee police. Because he actually did say during the 6 days when his wife was in that crate, he had in his mind to chop up the body and then go back to London and distribute the parts around the Thames. Does that remind you of anything? Well, if you are a regular to the pub test, you would know of the Thames torso murders that were happening around the same time as the Ripper killings. And what did the Thames torso murderer do? Distribute the parts around the Thames. So the question is, was he thinking of doing that as a copycat to crimes that he would have heard about back in London? Or had he actually perpetrated crimes like that himself before and knew that was the best way to dispose of the body? Yet the problem he would have faced here is that journey back. Like, that just was not going to happen. But the fact it was on his mind, yeah, was it copycat or was it just a reenactment of things he'd already previously done? Well, we'll put that to the pub test soon. Well, this is what passes the pub test for me as to why he moved to Dundee. He realised that the money was running out himself. He realised his lifestyle had to change. He could no longer be this violent drunkard. So he thought in his mind, if I can get to Dundee, somewhere fresh, new location, I can change my life. But unfortunately, many addicts find out that changing location will not change your actions. You have to change your actions before you move, or you will take your bad habits with you. And no doubt an argument erupted between himself and Ellen on that fateful day in February in 1889. And then he, like the coward that he is, attacked her from behind, strangling her. And as I said, that detail is interesting. And I will be now discussing something that I haven't really gone into in the series so far, but how 3 of the victims were most likely positioned when they were attacked in Whitechapel, and why it bears striking similarity to what happened to Ellen in this room. Now, if an unfortunate was seeking company of somebody, they would have to take him somewhere dark to a place. But you see, the bloke probably wouldn't have wanted to lie on the ground or get on the ground or even kneel on the ground because the streets were disgustingly filthy. And when they got home to their spouse, the spouse might say, how come all your clothes are that bad? So the woman would normally lean against the wall, but they'd be facing the wall. Sorry for putting these mental images in your mind. But you see, that would allow, at that moment, the woman to be so vulnerable, and the perpetrator then could strangle them from behind. And then, once they've done that, the throat was cut. That's why the blood flow on these women were less, because it said that the heart had already stopped because of the strangulation. But it's also why it was first thought that Jack the Ripper was left-handed, because they were assuming the cuts were done from the front, whereas it is more likely that they were done from behind on 3 occasions. And I say 3, then this is important. Elizabeth Stride and Mary Kelly probably were not killed that way. In fact, Elizabeth Stride appears to have had some defensive wounds on her. So the perpetrator may have attacked her from the front. Yet, people will say, yeah, but Ellen did not have her throat cut. That is true. But there's a good reason as to why that may not have been the case, because he was already in a secluded spot with her inside a house. No one really would have heard her scream and attract attention, so there was no need to do that silencing action, though still the cutting of the abdomen was very similar to the ones in Whitechapel. But when someone was attacked in Whitechapel, they had to be silenced quickly, hence the cutting of the throat. It does sort of match the MO of Jack the Ripper and what happened to Ellen. And even the stuffing inside the box, remembering the Thames torso murderer had a torso inside a crate in the new Scotland Yard building. That also draws comparisons. It is quite scary when we look at it. Now, I've already covered the Thames torso and the spreading of the body parts being a very similar action that he was thinking he could do, but there's also that writing on the wall inside that house in Dundee about Jack the Ripper. Now, there's three particular thoughts on this writing on the wall. Some people say it was already there when they moved in. Some kid had just, as a laugh, had done some graffiti inside an empty house at the time. Doesn't make a great deal of sense that a couple who have just come from the hotspot, from where these crimes actually were occurring, to move into a house and not rub that off, not get rid of it, because that would just be really, really creepy. So a second thought, though, is that Ellen wrote it on the wall herself. Like, after getting to Dundee, she realised that this bloke, he's a loser. He's hopeless. And she probably may have made the connection that he had perpetrated some crimes in Whitechapel. And so she started writing it up on the wall. And that's what set William Berry off into a fit of rage. And he couldn't control himself, and he did away with his wife. If that were true, Berry had 6 days to wipe that away. Like, why leave it on the wall when you're going to the police to say, I don't want to be done as being Jack the Ripper, and my wife has taken her own life? See, he's had all the time to get rid of that. What could be the third option? Well, that William Berry himself put that writing on the wall. And you might ask, well, why on earth would he do that? Well, we go into a bit of psychology here of some of these serial perpetrators. Now, it's said that there's a few of them, and I won't go into great detail here, but a few have even said they needed to be caught to be stopped. They wanted to be caught because they realized what they were doing was wrong, but they couldn't stop it themselves. It was like a drug. They were addicted to these particular crimes. And one famous serial killer himself said, please, police, catch me. This has to stop. So by him giving this ludicrous story, which he knows will be pulled apart the moment the police set inside that house, as soon as they see the scene, they're going to know that he is just full of lies. And so then he makes sure that they nail him for it by making the references to Jack the Ripper inside the house. And many of the eyewitnesses back in Whitechapel who saw someone with the victims just before their death described a shorter person, around 5'3", which William Berry was, dark complexion, he had dark hair and dark mustache, and foreign looking. Now, this is also, I find, quite intriguing because it's normally assumed that when people said foreign looking, they meant someone from overseas, like a Jewish person. So a natural assumption was, oh, you were talking about a Jew, or you were talking about a Russian or something else. But actually, in that area, in fact, in all of England at the time, the term foreigner just meant someone not from the local area. And William Berry was not from London. He'd only just moved there, so to them he could have looked like a foreigner, because they would have picked the fact that he wasn't a Londoner. And that would fit so many eyewitness accounts to William Berry being the last person seen with at least 2 of the victims. Now here's a spoiler alert. William Berry was convicted of the murder of his wife Ellen. Fairly obvious. But he was sentenced to death. Now, without going into that whole trial, but he was the last person to be executed in Dundee. In fact, they tried not to hang him, the jury. They didn't want to, but the judge basically forced their hand and said, you got to do this because of what this bloke did. The hangman himself was known to say, "I hung Jack the Ripper." And yes, the police from Scotland Yard had actually sent a couple of officers to interview Berry. And then they asked the hangman to try and have a conversation with him before the event and see if he can't get a confession from him about being Jack the Ripper. And they were listening into that conversation. And you can see, apparently, from what was recorded, that the hangman was trying to, egg him on a little. And Berry did say a couple of strange things like "you're going to do this to me," like William Berry was important, but he did not say anything about being Jack the Ripper. But the hangman said that, "No, I definitely did hang the Ripper." See, the problem though with the hangman were that they drank a lot before and drank even more after they did an event. It was a side hustle for them. They weren't doing this every day, but they got paid quite a decent chunk of cash to perform the executions. But the records show that the establishment were having problems with these hangmen, particularly around this time, and they were basically saying, "We need to get a better class of person, or you blokes need to lift your game, because we can't have our executioners acting like nutters at pubs around these events." And I do believe this bloke was just running his mouth. And oddly enough, the hangman's last name was Berry. Very coincidental. No relation, by the way, but that is just one of those other strange coincidences that happen around this Jack the Ripper saga. But William Berry was known not to drink on a Sunday, and we know alcohol fueled his rage. He would fly off, and that would happen 6 days of the week, but not on the Sunday. And interestingly, of all the crimes that happened during the Autumn of Terror, not a single one occurred from Sunday lunch to Monday morning. And they're the days William Berry was not drinking. Also, as part of the psychology which points to William Berry is his lack of remorse. Even in his confession, he was speaking matter-of-factly, and at no time did he ever really express sorrow for what he did to Ellen. That is very typical of a true psychopath. They actually can't feel empathy. For as much as us people, we see these things and we are horrified by them, and we get this natural aversion. We think, how could anyone do that? Because it's just not right. They have the same feeling towards us in the sense of, why do you care so much? If it's not affecting you, it really shouldn't matter. And I know that is weird, but you look at some of these psychopaths that have been caught, and I've seen a few of them, and one bloke in particular was interviewed, and he was asked, "Do you feel any guilt over what you did?" And he honestly looked at the person and said, "No. I should feel something, but I just don't." And that probably sums it up. See, how could you just marry someone, start taking all her money, beat her, and do all these things and not feel any compassion or remorse or guilt? It's not shown that he ever did to his wife, and possibly to many, many other people as well. But now, he didn't confess. He was on death row, and here was an opportunity to basically make the claim, "Yep, I was Jack the Ripper," go down in even more infamy, rather than just being the last bloke executed in Dundee for murdering his wife. But he never. But that also sometimes is that mark of the psychopath. They want to stay in control. They don't want to give up anything. Yet, the police from London did go to interview him, and had he have said, "Yes, I'm Jack the Ripper," it may have given him an opportunity to get a stay of execution, because they would have wanted to know more details. And perhaps they want to bring him back and try him for those crimes in London to put all of that to bed. But the police from London in the day did not seem to make that connection. So does this pass the pub test? Was William Berry Jack the Ripper? I'm going to give you my confusing answer to that. No, but possible. And I'll explain it. I'm not sitting on the fence here. What I'm saying is, no, I don't see him being Jack the Ripper in the sense of committing all those 5 crimes in Whitechapel. Even though they point to Ada Wilson as being a precursor to these crimes, she was attacked with a penknife and slashed at quite badly. She survived. And William Berry was known to sleep with a penknife underneath his pillow, which is also a mark of a bit of a psychopath, so they say. But many psychologists say that attack was the serial killer leading up to the Martha Tabram attack and then the subsequent crimes afterwards. But what I'm saying is, because of the way of the strangulation from behind that happened, I do not see him doing the Elizabeth Stride crime, nor do I see him doing the Mary Kelly crime. So no, he's not Jack the Ripper in that sense, but he would be on the list of someone to have committed at least 1 or 2 of these crimes, possibly, considering what he did to his own wife only not long after. And there was a fascination with Jack the Ripper, and that writing on the wall is rather eerie. Of course, all of that could have been he put that on there because he maybe did actually feel some remorse for what he did to his wife. And perhaps he thought the people in Dundee don't want to execute people, so I'll take my chances at trial. That didn't work out for him. So the idea of him spreading Ellen's body parts across the Thames I see more as a copycat idea. That's something that he's heard about and thought, I could do that, and they'll maybe think that perpetrator did this crime. But in my personal opinion, I see William Berry just as a wife-beating and end up being a wife-killing coward who found a nice person and just took her for absolutely everything he could get. And once the money ran out, she was of no use. And then in a drunken rage, he did what he did. And then, because he wasn't this mastermind criminal, he wasn't this sinister Jack the Ripper, he had to give himself up. So no, I don't believe William Berry was Jack the Ripper. But let me know what you think. Do you think William Berry could have been Jack the Ripper? I mean, I mentioned it in a different video on the French Ripper that unmasking the person, we found out who Joseph Vacher was, and he was the same cowardly, opportunistic perpetrator as William Berry was. And so it wouldn't be surprising if unmasked, that's the type of person we're going to find as perpetrating those Whitechapel crimes. But as always, your viewing these is greatly, greatly appreciated. All your support, all your encouragement, even all of the criticisms and suggestions that are made in comments as well. I appreciate that too. So thank you very, very, very much for watching. Give us a like, give us a subscribe. I'm Owen, you've been watching The Pub Test, and we will see you on the next one.